It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Matthew Hughes. Hi, Matthew. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, where are you now?
I'm in a little town called, well, actually a suburb called North Saanich at the south end of Vancouver Island, just above Victoria.
Okay.
Camping out with some friends because our house-sitting adventure in France was abruptly canceled by the pandemic.
I think the pandemic is really causing people lots of problems all over the place. What is it like in Canada? Because the U.S., well, quite honestly, the U.S. is a mess right now with an election that's yet to have been called, although some people think it's been called. And they're talking about a national lockdown, which is, not very popular with a lot of people. What's going on in Canada with it?
Well, we've done pretty well in terms of controlling it. We don't have a large number of people who reject the whole idea of wearing masks and social distancing. However, in the more populous provinces, Ontario and Quebec, there has been a resurgence which has them worried. People have been getting together in bars and gyms and not being as responsible as they need to. Now, where I am in British Columbia, the westernmost part of Canada, and especially on Vancouver Island, I think we've had a total of maybe 250 cases since the whole thing began.
Wow. On
this island. And that's, it's an island of hundreds of thousands of people. We have what you guys call a socialist provincial government, which has just been reelected with an enormous mandate because everybody approves of what they've been doing in terms of managing this pandemic. By and large, we are much better off than in the States, and here in BC, we're much better off than in the central part of the country.
So are things open there? I mean, is it business as usual? Yeah. Business as usual with masks? It's masks and social distancing, and as you walk in the door, there's hand sanitizer. If you go to a restaurant for dinner, people are wearing masks as you go in. They take your name and a contact number. In case there's any kind of outbreak, they can contact you and do the, trace and test kind of thing. And testing is readily available to everybody? Yeah.
Yeah, we have national health care here, and everything is available to everybody for free.
Okay. How is travel? Are you allowed to travel anywhere in Canada?
Yes. If you're driving down the highway, you're liable to see a big sign that says, "Don't do this if it's not necessary." And if you're heading for the ferry terminal, which is 5 minutes from here, there's a big sign over the highway that tells you, how many berths are available. And it also says masks are mandatory. They won't let you on without one. And everybody pretty much says, well, that makes sense. So everybody has masks, and they wear them when they're in public.
Well, hopefully we'll get it together in this country. I don't know. We seem to have so many issues going on at the same time that it's just like, where do you begin?
You guys have a tendency, given your political structure, to politicize virtually anything.
That's true.
And that makes a problem.
Okay, moving on. Which book are you promoting now?
Well, by a wonderful coincidence, my one that I call my magnum opus, the book that I waited more than 40 years to write, and which is my 23rd novel sale. It's a historical novel with magical realism called What the Wind Brings. And it's based on true events that happened in Ecuador in the middle of the 1500s. Some African slaves were shipwrecked on the coast, in the jungle coast, and they blended in with the local indigenous people And then when the conquistadors from up in Quito tried to come and recapture them, they fought them off for 20 years until finally the Spanish said, well, we really need a port at the mouth of the river that these people control, so let's make a deal with them. And they made a deal, and the society that they created of Africans and indigenous people endured forever. In fact, there are parts of that region now, if you go up the little back creeks and bayous, you essentially find Africa. They've been there and they've succeeded ever since.
Is this true?
Yeah. One of my characters in the book, most of the characters in the book are real people who did exist. And one of them is actually an official national hero of Ecuador.
So it's a fictional story based on real things?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And I'm pleased to be able to say that last night, it won the Endeavour Award, which is an award given to a science fiction or fantasy novel, and this qualifies because it has magical realism in it, written by somebody who lives in Cascadia, BC, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, Alberta, Idaho, I think, too. And they've been giving out that award for 20 years, and I'm the first Canadian to win it, as far as I can tell.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
What is magical realism? Can you explain what that is?
It's a fantasy element that it almost always seems to be something to do with South America. You can have things happen in stories that manifestly aren't possible. In my case, one of the key characters is a shaman of the native people, and she has real powers. She can go into the spirit world and she can heal people, and she knows what's coming before it's coming because her spirit guide, an eagle, tells her, shows her. So it's not a very well-defined term, but if you're writing about South American cultures, it seems to be perfectly legit to bring in some things that can't really happen, but everybody takes for granted in the story that they are happening.
So something that includes magical realism would include perhaps what the indigenous people call visions or out-of-the-body experiences, things like that? Yes,
yeah. And also, you might find that, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm not that well read in South American fiction, but you could have a story in which a saint like the Virgin of Guadalupe is quite real and is a character in the story.
I'm just looking at your pictures in your bio. Has anybody ever told you bear a similar resemblance to Ernest Hemingway?
Actually, yes. When I've had my hair cut short, yeah,
and the beard, yeah,
fuller.
Well, that's
yeah. I have had people have said that. Yes, I don't write like Hemingway. He was even more of a minimalist than I am, but I'm quite happy to welcome the comparison.
Well, I think it's a compliment. I think I would take it as one.
Yeah, as long as I don't end up the way he did.
Well, yeah, that was unfortunate. Okay, I wanted to ask you something else that I see here on your bio. It says, you waited more than 40 years to write this particular novel after first learning of the shipwreck in a footnote to a university textbook back in 1971. Mm-hmm. But you have also published 23 novels in the meantime. Is that correct?
Yes, yep.
Okay, so why did you wait so long to write this one then?
Well, I'm an intuitive writer. I'm not a guy who plans and outlines a plot. Stories develop in the back of my head, and then they come out a bit at a time when I'm writing them. In the case of this one, for a long time, I simply could not find any research material because, as I say, when I told it to you just now, you'd never heard of it. And virtually nobody in North America had heard of it. up until the past 10 years or so. So when I started trying to research it back, as long ago as the 70s and 80s, I couldn't find any English language academic material, almost none. And apparently the only scholarship in those days was in South American Spanish language academic journals. And I can do, donde está la pluma de mi tía kind of Spanish, but not academic Spanish, densely packed. But it was only in this century that the events and the personalities became of interest to North American scholars, American mostly, and thus papers and books began to appear, which amplified what little I knew about what had happened when these people were shipwrecked on the coast. And then it became possible for me to really think about what the story was going to be and who the characters were. And I just let it develop gradually and gently in the back of my head, because publishers were offering me contracts to do science fiction or fantasy novels, and also to contribute to some quite well-received anthologies and magazines and so on. So I knew it was going to take an enormous amount of time, and the chance of getting it pre-sold to a publisher without an agent. A great big historical novel is a hard sell even when you've got an agent and it's finished. I let it sit, but I went to the Canada Council for the Arts and said, could I have some money to write this book? And they said, yes, here's $25,000. So I sat down and I spent a year doing not much anything else but writing this book. And it went through 4 complete drafts, which is unusual for me. Usually 2 drafts and we're done. But that was it. First, it was not being able to get the research material, and then it was having to eat while I wrote it. I insist on eating every day.
Well, I think it's a good habit.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Love coffee, huh? But wait a minute. It seems like every time you finish a cup of coffee, you get all of these side effects along with it. Heartburn, indigestion, upset stomach, acid reflux. As the world's first and only organic acid-free coffee, Tyler's Coffee is able to provide a healthier option in the solution for more than 100 million individuals who have sensitive stomachs or suffer from acid-related modalities. This is Tyler's acid-free coffee. Coffee without the consequences.
Hi, this is John Morgan, production supervisor for DJC Productions. You're listening to The Douglas Coleman Show.
Also on your bio, it says that you were inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Association's Hall of Fame.
Yes.
So science fiction and fantasy is your primary genre of writing, is that correct?
Well, okay. I actually set out in the 90s as I was coming to the end of raising children, and I was been making my living as a freelance speechwriter in Vancouver and in BC. But I wanted to write fiction, which is what I'd always wanted to do. And I actually set out to be a crime writer, a writer of crime fiction. I had a novel published by Doubleday Canada, and I started selling stories to Alfred Hitchcock magazine and other places. I won an award from the Crime Writers of Canada for Best Short Story of 1999. But then a couple of flukes happened. An old novel that I first had published in 1994, a fantasy novel, which died as it was being published because the publisher was taken over and dissolved. I managed to sell that to Time Warner Books, and they asked for a sequel, so I wrote the sequel as well. And then Tor said we'd like one of those, so I wrote one for them. And then an outfit called Nightshade Books had read some stories I'd had in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and they said, well, couldn't you write novels about these characters? And I said, sure. And they said, well, we'll take 3. And next thing I knew, I was writing science fiction and fantasy, rather in the mode of the great Grandmaster Jack Vance, who is my idol in this regard. I do tend to write crime stories in a science fiction or fantasy setting. My characters are thieves and rogues and forgers and wizards' henchmen, not wizards and heroes. I tend to write anti-heroes. I didn't notice that until I'd written several of them, but that's what I do. So yes, I am a science fiction and fantasy author, but I am really a crime writer trapped in the career of a science fiction and fantasy author.
Let's talk a little bit about science fiction, because science fiction has this nasty habit of becoming reality 20 or 30 years after it's written, at least in some cases.
Yeah, I'm going to give you an argument on that.
All right.
I read a book back in the 60s called Limbo. It was a one-time author, a literary kind of beatnik author from New York, who wrote this thing in 51. It was published in 52, and it's set in the 1990s, as he imagined, more or less. But as he said in an afterword, and the guy's name was Bernard Wolfe, and I recommend the book as a fascinating piece of parallel history. It's the history that never actually happened. I reread it about 10 years ago because it popped up somewhere in being available for a place where I would write reviews from time to time. And I read it again, and I was struck. You know, I was 16 when I read it the first time, and now I'm an old guy who's lived through all of those years. And I noticed all the things that he did not predict, like credit cards, like the emancipation of women, like the civil rights movement and the change in the status of people of color in the U.S. But as the man said in the afterword that he wrote for that edition, he wasn't really predicting the future. What he was doing was writing about 1952, if 1952 had gone on just the way it was for 40 years. And I think that's very often what you actually get in science fiction is we're talking about now, but we're, moving it forward 20 years or 100 years or whatever, and saying, if this goes on and continues, here's what's going to happen. But it's all about now.
Well, I guess I wasn't referring particularly to political or social change. I was more making a comparison with the actual technology changes. For example, Star Trek of the 1960s, the original show, there are things in that show that were not available to people that looked like. Do you know what I mean? Like flat screen monitors.
Were wonderful things that just make anything you want, and now we have the beginnings of 3D printing,
right?
Which actually look like they might be replicators in another 20 years.
And the little communicators that they had were flip phones Motorola made in the 90s. And, just there were things that did happen that kind of looked like what they were trying to do in the 60s. I guess that's what I meant.
There is some of it. It's, as you say, the social and political and so on. They usually don't get that at all. We're a very long way right now from the Star Trek universe. And also with the technology, you can see things that people got more or less right, like flip phones and so on.
Right. And things they got wrong.
Then there's all kinds of things that never happened.
Flying cars. Yeah.
Like shuttle rockets to go to Mars for the weekend, that kind of thing. Or the moon.
Well, not yet. I mean, I would argue maybe in 100 years we might be there. Possibly.
Might very well in 100 years, yes. Yeah. But remember, the movie was called 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it did not expect that the entire space program would virtually be reduced to a microcosm.
Yeah. You know who Robert J. Sawyer is?
Yes. Yeah. He's a friend of mine.
Okay. He was on the show.
I actually house sat for him a few years ago. Yeah.
Okay.
He's got a wonderful place, a penthouse, and it is full of every kind of science fictional paraphernalia, collector's items that you could possibly imagine. It's like if you were 12 years old, you would just go, oh, my God.
I kind of imagine, because even he was on our video edition show, and even the camera shot, there were Star Trek models and things in the background. And, yeah, it looked like a 12-year-old boy's room, really did.
Mm-hmm. A 12-year-old boy's room with a great big credit card.
With a great big credit card, yeah. But one of the things that him and I got into a conversation about was AI. And do you do any writings on that? Any speculations on how far AI will advance?
No. I have them in my stories. But the fact is, I'm not in any way a technologist. I'm a techno-barbarian. Fortunately, I have a son who's a computer genius and does things like get Skype on my machine for me and so on, so we can talk. Okay. I also have to confess, and I do this readily, I have not kept up with reading science fiction or fantasy since the 1980s. Mostly I've read, if I'm reading genre, I've read crime fiction, because that's what I intended to write. So my science fiction is decidedly old-fashioned science fiction. People have said many of the stories that I've sold to magazines and anthologies could have been written and published in the 1950s or 60s.
So you don't incorporate futuristic technologies in your science fiction?
Oh, I do, but I have no idea how they work.
Oh, I see.
And I don't explain them. I mean, in the space opera stuff, I have flying cars, and they are lifted by something called gravity obviators. And I have no idea how a gravity obviator would work, but I just need cars to fly, so we have flying cars.
Well, sounds good.
Yeah. Nobody complains. I've never had anybody say, what we need is some dense paragraphs explaining the technology of this. They seem to be quite happy just to have the story move along.
Anything else you want to bring up before we wrap this up? Did we cover everything? Is there another book? Or?
Yeah, I've got something coming up.
Okay.
As I mentioned, I'm a great devotee of the work of Jack Vance, a grand master of science fiction who died in 2013. He wrote some quite iconic science fiction works and fantasy. One of them was a 5-novel series, short novels, but 5 of them, called The Demon Princes, which has nothing to do with demons. It's a space opera story, and they are 5 master criminals who do a terrible thing to one guy's community, take everybody away that they don't kill, they're slavers. And then he spends years of his life tracking them down and killing them, each one. I have written an authorized sequel to The Demon Princes. It's called Barbarians of the Beyond, which is a Vancian kind of title. And it probably will be published by John Vance, who is Jack's son, and who has a press called Spatterlight Press, where he's been republishing his dad's work, and also in the past year or so, allowing people like me to play in Jack Vance's sandbox, not with his characters, but with his settings. I've done the the book, Barbarians of the Beyond, is finished. It's in the hands of John, and we're moving towards getting some advanced reading copies prepared to send out. I'm hoping it might get some interest from a big commercial publisher that might say, well, this would do well in mass market paperback. But if not, then it will be produced as a print-on-demand paperback and an ebook by Spatterlight sometime in the coming year. And I'm hoping it kind of makes a splash, because I really enjoyed writing in a Jack Vance universe, and I think there are still a lot of Vance fans out there, as well as my own, who will look forward to this and enjoy it when it comes.
Do you have a website you want to give out? People can come check out your work.
The catch-all term for my stories has always been the Arcanate, Archonate, and that is the name of my website. If you look up Arcanate, you'll invariably be pointed towards me.
All right. Do you want to spell that again?
Archonate.
Arcanate.com?
Well, it's actually MatthewHughes.org, but it's just easier to Google Arcanate and Hughes, and you'll find me. It used to be Arcanate.com, but things change.
Okay. Well, we need a .com just so we can actually put it up. I don't need to put an explanation.
Then it's Matthew Hughes, one word, two T's in Matthew, and then .org.
Okay, that's better.
Some other Matthew Hughes had scored the com before I did.
Oh, don't you hate that? Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show. Nice talking to you. And congratulations on your Endeavour Award. That's exciting.
Thank you.